The F1 season in 2024 is just days away from kicking off with the 2024 Bahrain Grand Prix. And this year marks the 20th anniversary of that race, kicking off the longest season in Formula One history. I'm Steph Wentworth, and joining me today we have Jake Boxall-Legge and Haydn Cobb. Welcome to the both of you. Before we get onto the data, let's preview some of the technical aspects of the cars this weekend. And actually, we'll break this into three main segments, starting off with the 2024 tech, moving on to performance data, and then looking ahead to the race itself. Okay, seeing as we have our technical specialist, JBL, here, let's start with the tech stuff. RB20. Lots of people are arguing that there are many similarities to the W14, but the Red Bull family have evolved and developed that concept to kind of make it work. What can we say about those specific upgrades on the RB20 in comparison to the Mercedes?
Well, testing was our first chance to really see what was going on with the side pod inlets, what was going on with quite a lot of the car actually, because they kept it very conspicuously hidden over its launch. So it was good to kind of see it finally out in the open, and it was very apparent the side pod treatment they've gone for is very, very different to what everybody else has. We suspected they had like a vertical kind of inlet, which they do have on the RB20, but there's also a kind of smaller horizontal inlet kind of recessed into the side pod undercut, really. So it's really interesting design characteristic, trying to reduce the size of those inlets as much as possible. But what they have is they have another set, I guess, either side of the driver's head. So one of the areas that you speak of being similar to the Mercedes W14 is those very, very high shoulders around the engine cover. And so what we've got there is a kind of channel in the middle, and they've been able to kind of put an inlet into that where the halo mounts the chassis. But there's also sort of loads of cooling gubbins and sort of fins and inlets and outlets and that sort of thing. So it's really interesting to see the way that they've kind of gone for trying to work out what the right mass flow rate of air cooling that they need is, and kind of almost spreading it around the car so that they can have the sort of best aerodynamic effect around the side pod and sort of everywhere, really, without sort of doing the traditional thing. Obviously, when the W14 came out last year, they'll have looked at some of the characteristics of it and tried it out in the wind tunnel. That's just something that all the teams do. Not necessarily wind tunnel, but CFD as well. Everybody kind of tries each other's things to kind of work out what they're doing. So I think that's kind of probably where the genesis of that had probably come from. And then they'd seen something that they liked in it, and that's why they've chosen to pursue this route.
Well, we'll wait and see what Red Bull have up their sleeve this weekend. On to Ferrari. They've been one of the only teams to keep that rear pull rod suspension layout. Why do you think this is from their perspective?
Well, this is something that their technical director, Enrico Cardillo, actually spoke about, because obviously teams switching to a push rod rear has been quite a sort of talking point over the off-season. So why hasn't Ferrari done it? Why has it kind of gone away from what this year's convention is? And Ferrari reckons that they couldn't really find enough benefit in it for what the weight, with regards to weight saving, with regards to compliance in the rear suspension. They didn't find enough advantage in the push rod to, move away from it, basically. What they have with regards to their suspension is something that works really, really nicely on the curbs. That's been a trait of Ferrari for the last few years, actually. You just kind of see it, like, especially with the old, I think it was back in 2019 in Singapore, you could just see how nicely it rode those curbs, and it's kind of kept that characteristic. And that's really, really, really confidence inspiring for the drivers in sort of slower speed corners. I guess kind of the entrance into the slow speed corners last year wasn't a particularly good strength, but once you're in it and once you're exiting, Ferrari was pretty decent there. And they've tried to enhance that effect more. The drivers are a lot more happy with the handling. So it seems that their decision to stick with the pull rod has been justified. It does have a sort of slight centre of gravity bonus with compared to a push rod suspension. You have all of the springs a lot lower down. But the downside and why everybody is moving to the push rod is largely for an aerodynamic effect, where you're just not using as much of the floor space as you can to house springs and things like that. So it's a trade-off, but Ferrari didn't think it was worth it.
And kind of sticking on Ferrari and their characteristics, they've kind of gone for a fat nose, and we're seeing these appearing more. The Alpine has one, Red Bull has. What is this concept that kind of seems to be spreading and reigniting? And what does it mean? What's it doing?
So obviously, with regards to the front end of the car, that's kind of where you set everything up for what you want to do. The wing is hugely important. What you do with the nose is hugely important as well. I don't think necessarily all the teams have sort of gone with the wide nose direction. Mercedes and RB, they've gone for sort of quite narrower noses. But again, it's all about what you want to do with the airflow around the front of the car. And it's also about where you stop that nose as well. Red Bull, for example, they're extruding the nose all the way to the leading edge of the front wing. Some teams are stopping it an element short. Again, it's what you want to do. But basically, what you can do with a sort of wider nose, if you like, is you can control the airflow, for a wider sort of area, I guess. But what you're also trying to do is you're kind of wrapping the airflow around to the nose, because what you're going to get is you're going to get some degree of separation underneath, and you just kind of want to trim that off so that you don't have this pocket of drag around the front end, because if you sort of have that sort of draggy wake, if you like, and it's going towards the floor, you're just going to have this sort of pocket of very sort of not particularly energized airflow going underneath, and that's going to be really detrimental to your floor performance. So it's all about how you mitigate that, how you energize that air in that area, by stopping like with Ferrari have done, by kind of taking it to the top three elements and kind of stopping it before the bottom one. What you've got is a free slot gap, and you can use that to trim off airflow on the underside. It kind of depends what teams have found in the wind tunnel and what they deem is the best option. But it's certainly a trend that we've seen. Whether Mercedes and whether RB will go in that direction later in the season remains to be seen. But certainly seems to be a trend. I think that's what the 2022 show car came with. Nobody really went for it in the start, and now everybody's sort of going back to that old idea.
I know, we're finally getting to see it out in action. All right, finally, to conclude our tech segment, should we say, have you noticed any other trends that we're likely to see throughout the season among any of the other teams?
Just back on front wings, they've become hugely interesting this season. There's a few sort of obviously the Mercedes one is the big ticket item there for sure. You've got that really, really narrow top element between the sort of like the part where the wing flap adjusts and the nose, and that's literally there to satisfy the rule that says you must have 4 wing elements there. They're not using that for performance. It's literally there to tick a box. What you've actually got is you've got this wing element on the other side of the flap adjuster that's not actually connected to it. You've got a very, very tiny gap between it and the next part of that wing. And what this is doing is you're going to be able to create a vortex here, and that's something really important. That's something that aerodynamicists have been doing for a number of years. I think ever since the kind of regulations changed in around 2009, 2010, they wanted to use the wingtips for a vortex because they can wrap that around the rear tyres of the car. You're keeping the tyre wick away from the floor, and therefore the floor is getting lots of lovely clean airflow. And Mercedes has found a way to do that. That's something the FIA wanted to get away from. That's why the wing element's attached to the nose now, because what it does is it creates a load of what we call dirty air that's detrimental to the overtaking product on track. So that's just something that the FIA wanted to do, and Mercedes has found a way to get around that. I was lucky enough to go up and down the pit lane during testing, and the Haas front wing was surprisingly interesting. The RB front wing was quite interesting. Seeing that the way that all of these teams are putting tiny little winglets onto the rear end of the end plate to try and strengthen the flow in that area, that's quite an interesting trend. So yeah, it's been really cool to see. I think almost a bunch of old ideas come back. We've had 2 years with this rule set now, and teams are finding ways to kind of bring in, I guess, components that were outlawed in between 21 and 22, and bring them back for performance gains, I think is quite interesting.
Excellent. Well, thanks, JBL, for breaking all of that down for us. We're going to move on to a bit of data and performance now. In terms of both one-lap pace and the long runs, it looks like Mercedes and Ferrari are quite close to Red Bull, but you could argue that Red Bull is just not showing the extent of their car just yet. What can we understand from the data so far, and how does it compare to what we've seen so far?
I think it's safe to say that Red Bull is still head and shoulders in front of everyone. Of course, and this counts for all teams, we never truly know engine modes or fuel loads when they go on these long runs, in particular, looking at the race simulations. But for the sake of looking at what happened last year and going on trends, they're largely in rank of where you would expect them to all be. So they're probably not all showing their full hand in terms of engine modes, of course. There's no obligation to, but it's safe to say that particularly in the hands of Verstappen, when he was on his race sims and quite quickly into them over that 3 days of pre-season testing, looked very comfortable, and the pace was there above the rest of the teams. Perez, particularly when he was doing his race sim during testing, it was more comparable to the Ferrari, and that sort of gave this sense of maybe Ferrari have made a game, particularly with their focus on race runs, with looking after the tyres and making sure they can last a full stint. Now, is that a sort of a closer gap because of driver versus driver or car versus car? Again, difficult to know because they were running at totally different times. But I think you could hesitate to say, just going on again on trends, Verstappen will probably have that step over Perez, at least to start with. Therefore, the Red Bull package probably is as strong as we've seen it in his hands compared to, say, the closer gaps when it was a sort of Perez and Sainz doing their race runs at a similar sort of time. But it does seem to be pretty close, and I think the trend will continue of it could easily be track dependent as well. As JBL was mentioning the tech front there, circuits that suit the sort of philosophy and the package that each team has delivered, Ferrari, I think Ferrari and Mercedes in this scenario, could see them sort of pull that difference slightly smaller or get ahead of each other in that sense. But you'd still safely assume that Red Bull look to have a decent sort of chunk of time on the others, but we'll sort of see how it goes when everything sort of shakes out come Saturday's Grand Prix.
And what about the midfield, Haydn? Because obviously it will probably fluctuate throughout the season. It's very tightly packed with, the McLaren, the Aston, the RB. They kind of seem to be the next group of cars behind the front runners, should we say. What can we say about their quali pace and their race pace so far from our understanding?
It's fair to say probably McLaren, out of all those that are listed, are potentially the harder ones to put a sure sign on, mostly because of their disruptive running. Now, it certainly wasn't as bad as they've had in recent years with their brake issues or general car problems that they've faced. There was just niggly things here with a clutch or an engine sort of throttle mapping, and therefore they didn't get their race sims in at the same time as everyone else. And I think people can definitely correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think Norris really got a clean race sim throughout the entire testing program. Obviously, he got long runs in, but nothing that was useful in terms of a comparison. Piastri, on the other hand, and did. So again, you sort of have a question mark over them. You wouldn't expect them to be too far away from where they ended last season, but there's this sort of unknown of maybe they could be in that Ferrari Mercedes bracket, or maybe they will just be a little bit behind. Aston, again, I think they looked to have made progress, but I think it's at the same rate of everyone else. They've obviously gone for the evolution front rather than any sort of huge change concept. So it'll be, again, interesting to see where they are. And as everyone sort of said, there's big one eye on this new RB, what was AlphaTauri before, having taken a lot of design inspiration, to put it politically correct, from Red Bull. Does that give them an immediate boost? Will be clear. I think they've certainly made one hell of a jump over the winter through the developments and the changes they've made to that car. And with a driver lineup of Ricciardo, Tsunoda, you'd think they'd be able to hit the ground running, because they're two incredibly experienced drivers. You won't have a Tsunoda trying to fight the fight for the team with De Vries struggling at the start of last year. So you would certainly expect them to be there or thereabouts in terms of the midfield fight, and certainly starting far stronger than they did last year. The rest of them could be a bit of hit or miss season so far.
Yes, and looking slightly further back, it does seem as though kind of we've lost Alpine and Sauber from that further forward group, should we say, and they're kind of alongside a struggling Haas and Williams. Is this a surprise for both of those teams? Is it a surprise to see, and can we see them maybe moving forward throughout the rest of the season?
Certainly. I think starting with Alpine, and I will definitely throw to JBL on this one from a technical point, is it's clear, and they've made it very open, that they've hugely changed their car in almost every area, looking for this sort of development breakthrough, a little bit like other teams have, but it hasn't, at least so far, with 3 days of running, has not worked. And looking at those sort of the race runs and looking at the times, they really are on the back foot. And I think that is because of all these changes. They're still learning about this, effectively, this new car. Gasly put on a brave face at the end of the third day of running, but they openly admitted they weren't where they want to be. And if they're saying that publicly, then privately it probably means a great deal more in terms of where they are in the pecking order. But JBO, is that fair to say in terms of where Alpine have gone with this new direction?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Matt Harmon said at the launch, pretty much everything on the car is new, only the steering wheel really carries over, which I found surprising because it looks very kind of similar in ethos compared to last year's car. I think these are largely internal changes, try and get a little bit, just improve the packaging, get a little bit more out of the powertrain, because given Alpine is very keen to point out that it's about 30 brake horsepower down on everyone else's powertrains. But what we can glean by the fact that there's so much exposed carbon on the livery is that it's slightly overweight, and this is something that Bruno Famin, the team principal, was a little bit coy about. He didn't particularly want to talk about that too much. He said that the team was on target with where it was, but it does seem that it's a bit overweight, and it does seem that the drivers aren't particularly happy with it at this moment in time. I did get to watch a little bit of the Alpine's trackside, and it just didn't have that sharpness, that bite going into turn 11 particularly, because that's a corner where you've got to, and we saw this in testing, a lot of drivers going kind of wide, loading up and then snapping the steering wheel over to the left-hand side and going up the hill. And it just seemed to be a little bit lazy in that respect. Obviously the Red Bull was highly agile there. Ferrari, McLaren looked quite good there. Alpine just didn't have that X factor, let's say.
Yeah, and I guess you could say the same about those other teams that are in this bracket. Sauber, Williams, Haas as well. And trying to figure out exactly how they shake up is obviously very tricky now because it is very close. But yeah, taking Williams, for example, they openly acknowledged they had last year have had a very peaky car that works on certain circuits that suits the characteristic, and they've basically tried to design and change the car to be a more consistent all-round package. Now it seems that they may still have those strengths when they go to those sorts of areas, but trying to make those changes over one winter and indeed over just 3 days of testing means that you may, at least on paper, look a little bit further behind because you're learning it. Haas openly admitted as well that they're focusing on their biggest Achilles heel, a little bit like Ferrari, which was the race pace in terms of how absolutely destroys the tyres over a stint. And so therefore it almost made no sense for them to looked specifically at performance and won that running, because they know that previously they've had to that pace and that performance that they can, you've seen Haas quite regularly make the top 10 and in qualifying, but then just go backwards. So there was almost no point, let's say, during testing to focus on that. And sure, it's a nice shiny headline time, but it means 0 in terms of the World Championship. You get no points for testing. So I guess all you could also say is if they have been able to make breakthroughs or at least a big learning, they will hope to then deliver it this coming week and for the first few rounds. So yeah, as is always the way, it's the cliche, take the testing times with a big pinch of salt, because all teams have different programs and different targets.
Exactly, and we'll finally see performance for reals in just a couple of days. But moving on to the actual Grand Prix itself, because that's the juicy part of all of this. We said earlier, F1 is no stranger to racing in Bahrain. It is the 20th edition here in the desert. With pre-season testing also held here quite a few times in recent years, the teams have a lot of information on this track, and that will help their run plans and creating their strategy. How helpful is this in comparison to other tracks, for example? JBL?
I think it's certainly very helpful. It's almost like Barcelona syndrome. The teams have been there so much now that they've basically got a sort of almost a foolproof race plan. But the thing is, every year, particularly with the Bahrain circuit, is, ever since it was first raced in 2004, the asphalt has been exactly the same, and so it's got rougher and rougher throughout the seasons. And so we're at a point now where, if you look at the strategies from last season, like no team went without going for a two-stop, and some even for a three-stop. Such as the tyre degradation, they can overheat so easily here as well. So I think we're going to get some variance, certainly. Everybody looked really at home on the circuit over testing, so I don't know if there's going to be the situation where someone crashes out and we have a safety car or something like that. Everybody seemed to be really, really clean. But I think we'll get a lot of strategic variance for sure. I think that a team can still pull a rabbit out of a hat, so to speak. We're expecting the results to kind of go a certain way, and I guarantee that for some of it will be wrong, but that's the fun of pre-season predictions, isn't it?
And on the topic of strategy, Pirelli have selected the C1, C2 and C3 compound tyres for this weekend, which is the exact same compounds that they selected last year. But Lando Norris in the race in 2023 was actually the only driver to use the C2 compound tyre. Haydn, can we expect the same this year? I mean, last year was a two-stop strategy. Again, do we think we'll see the same thing?
I certainly would expect the majority of teams to target a two-stopper. And it will be that sort of same dilemma again, which will depend on a few of the factors that we already mentioned of temperature. Obviously, the grip levels will be incredibly high at the circuit off the back of testing, and then the Grand Prix weekend itself, which will aid tyre life. But equally, it could also depend on qualifying positions. If somebody qualifies out of position, that sort of naturally dictates their strategy options. But I would certainly, assume a two-stopper with the majority probably starting on the softest compound, obviously going on the back of qualifying. And then it's up to their strategic geniuses to figure out how best it can work in their favour. And as sort of JBL said, that the likelihood of a safety car, although not uncommon, I know that statistic always comes up, but it seems high, and there's almost like a safety car almost every other race. But for Bahrain, you would think that it's not so common outside of the first couple of laps. So again, but if that does happen and that does occur, then obviously that will kick in immediately and potentially could turn strategy on its head. So two-stopper, starting on the softs, going for probably hards, and then depending on how the race pans out, sticking with those or going to the mediums.
Absolutely, and reliability is also a key factor, as you mentioned, in terms of safety car and strategy. But over the 3 days of testing, the teams actually covered 19,996 kilometres of distance with fairly few issues overall. What did all of these long runs tell us about tyre deg, and how might that translate into strategy this weekend, Haydn?
I think on the whole, it's as expected. The tyre compounds themselves haven't changed a great deal from last year, and obviously the teams have a huge amount of data to go on, and on the whole, I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but the C3 and C2 compounds were certainly the most frequently used, obviously with one eye on the Grand Prix weekend itself as well. But I would expect to see it in terms of a two-stopper. A one-stop could probably, if with the aid, maybe a safety car be a thing, but largely, as you say, the abrasive nature of the Bahrain track means that the tyres themselves won't, in a race performance mode with those heavy fuel tanks to start the race with, they just won't last as long as it could to make it an easy one-stopper. But the teams have certainly got a lot of data to work on now, and it could certainly, with those that are already on top of their tyre management, it could open up more strategies for them.
Well, all right then. To round everything off, JVL, we'll start with you. Based off of everything we know so far, what do you expect going into this weekend?
What do I expect? I think I'm going to play it safe and say I think we can expect a Max Verstappen victory. I think we can expect Ferrari giving it as much as they can to try and stop that from being the case. And I think that, we've gone into this and we've made a lot of predictions about what we expect to happen for the season, where we expect teams to be. I think we could probably expect to be wrong at some point. I think it's just good to get back going again. Hopefully, I'm going to predict an interesting race.
I think we're all manifesting that. Haydn, what do you expect? Similar or anything different?
Similar, and going on, I guess you could just go form guide at Bahrain. You would fully expect in this era, Red Bull versus Ferrari at the front, and probably Verstappen to be at the head of that particular pack. Curious to see what McLaren could do, as I've sort of said before, in terms of their slightly difficult to read pre-season testing running. But also, if you go on last year, they still had those brake issues, and it was a nightmare opening round for them. I think if they finished way down the bottom, but I think there may have even been mechanical retirements thrown in there. So in terms of their very recent history at the Bahrain track, it is a bit of a unknown altogether. So if I was optimistic, maybe seeing a Piastri or Norris throwing in a bit of a surprise there, that would be good to have. And then who knows, that maybe that RB really has the pace to take for it and can get some big points early in the season. A bit like we've seen fairly recently with the likes of Haas. They've always been able to spring a surprise in the early rounds. So who knows? I wouldn't be that surprised if Ricciardo and Tsunoda can get some decent points early on.
Yeah, who knows indeed. Well, that just about does it. And now all that's left to do is for us to sit back and watch it unfold. Just a reminder, this race this weekend is on one day earlier. It will be taking place on the Saturday, so make sure you don't miss out. And subscribe to the channel to catch all of our continued coverage of the 2024 season. And while you're at it, let us know what your predictions are for the weekend. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.